Hello everyone, today we talk about Abyssinian aka Ethiopian warfare in the early modern age, mostly from the 16th to the mid 17th century. It's just an introduction to the warfare of this region. We do not know overwhelmingly much, but if we were to make, especially the strictly speaking military history of, like we've been mentioning, of the main wars and engagements, that would be really a lot to tell. There are several books that illustrate this. We present this culture. That they have a series about Renaissance armies that we tend to look at sort of block by block, right? Mostly based on single arms, say cavalry, infantry, artillery, etc. Here we condensate a bit everything to make it simpler, and also because of the aforementioned a lack of information. It's actually a topic that, together with practically all the ones I cover, I want to come back on. And we will surely for the Middle Ages as well, the medieval era, also the ancient ones. I made some videos, I think, about ancient. Well, that was mostly about Nubian fighters in the Achaemenid army, but it's not, say, specifically what we mean. Essentially, the kingdom of Aksum overlapped with Ethiopia, and that it's not even so simple. What in fact makes it really interesting is sort of the local political complexity and the sort of intense warfare that historically took place, like for considering it in proportion to its times and places, across the same Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So we have this Arabian influence, even an Indian one. You find troops from the African Horn fighting in India as well. We talked about it for Mughal warfare. And you have this contact in colonial times with the Portuguese, but before that, there is a general connection with the Arab world, the Ottoman world, as we'll see now. And so there's really a lot to unpack. So talking about the Ethiopian Empire, this is what basically we're discussing today, the Abyssinian Empire. We can start, say, talking about its military history with the contact with the Portuguese that are credited with the substantial introduction of firearms and artillery during their two Abyssinian expeditions in 1529 and 1541. Telling the truth, there had been some, say, Arab deserters that had brought with them some firearms before. There were already, of course, contacts with. There had been properly a firearm production coming from within the same country, but of course it was modest, right? We're not looking at a solid state here. It's just essentially in fact, an empire, right, ruled by the current clan that manages to extend its control on the more fertile areas, and they're very vast, right? But however, difficult to control. In the broader picture, it's mostly like a bushland. There are some very tough grounds, massive mountain ranges. The climate does vary as well, so we don't have all the time in the world today. But we can start again from the Portuguese that had already actually visited Ethiopia, starting from the late 15th century, with Pero de Corvilla making significant progress in establishing relations between Portugal and Ethiopia. And in 1501, Empress Dowager Eleni of Ethiopia sent another Orthodox, because this is what the Ethiopians were, an Armenian named Matthew, to request Portuguese aid against the Muslims. Here, the Ottomans are not yet in sight, but as you know, the Mamluks were still there, and generally speaking, whoever ruled Egypt, and generally speaking, had connection also with the south west of Arabia, tended to threaten, of course, like in this case, Ethiopia, like the broader African Horn, for many like strategical reasons, connected mostly with the very important trade routes passing through the straits, from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. This game was always going on. The Portuguese were now, as you know, expanding as an oceanic maritime force, and they were quite interested in this land because of their circumnavigation of Africa and the general interest in the in fact, in the Indian Ocean, and whoever could sort of assist them from there. So this embassy led to the arrival of a Portuguese fleet in the Red Sea. We are in 1520, so at 11 years of this, so it's still relevant, still important. There is, always remember, a connection here with, in this case, with Catholic powers. At this point in the Renaissance, you see also in the art, I've inserted here some literal Ethiopian copies of Italian paintings, because there is a strong connection that would form between this Chalcedonians and the Catholic world, right, against the Ottomans that, as you know, were wrestling with the Habsburgs for the control of the Mediterranean. So this other church is sort of grouped anyway, and Ethiopia always had, of course, an interest in, say, getting sort of more updated, innovative, civilized input, right, from also these relations with Armenia, for example, were dictated a bit by the same logic, because those were more developed peoples than Ethiopia as well, and of course the interest of the local emperors was the one of, say, strengthening their power on the basis of the more advanced powers existing at the time. The Portuguese were a good example for them. So Father Francisco Alvarez was among the members of the fleet that reached Ethiopia in 1520 and wrote one of the earliest accounts of the country. Consider that Ethiopia was not just constantly at war with her Islamic neighbors, but also with some pagans that had still to be won in Africa to either monotheism, and as we will see, the fact that some, especially this also Portuguese support was being given, of course, to this Christian power, brought the pagan enemies of Ethiopia to normally convert to Islam, right, to make damage against them. So it's interesting also, as we were saying before, to look at the Arabs, for example, that tended to, say, whoever at least like was, yes, because there was a decentralized Arabia that was subjected to, for example, Mamluk, later Ottoman influence. And as such, there were some local clans even there that would, say, bail out, be exiled, persecuted. They would go to Africa just next door and join with, say, for example, more updated weaponry. Not excessively so, because still Oman was not overwhelmingly advanced. I have a video in Coming List about medieval Arabian warfare that will explain this a little bit. The most important military event of this period is, however, the Ethiopian-Adal War, fought from 1529 to 1545. Now, I prepared a spin-off on the Adal Sultanate because we will actually cover this better in a video about Somali warfare that I will surely make at some point, but I don't have sort of the equivalent for this ready, so I thought to just talk a bit about the Adal Ethiopian relations. So here we can start from a bit before, because you have the Emperor Naud of Ethiopia and the Sultan Muhammad ibn Azar ad-Din attempting to maintain peace, right, in the previous generations, but their efforts were disrupted by the constant raids from the Emir Mahfuds into Christian territory. So now the Ethiopian emperor assembled a large army to confront Mahfuds. It was sort of, unleashed dog. But despite winning the battle against him, he was ultimately killed. There is a whole history of, say, martyrological symbolism in Ethiopian art and culture. Again, this was essentially a warlike population, at least, coming from a tribal background. That's, as we will see now, also from their arms and armor, what they were. So they felt very much that bloody excitement for killings, beheadings, this kind of terrifying that would truly exemplify Christ's passion in the Christian key. By the way, like this Christian, stereotypically every Ethiopian woman is called Mariam, almost. It's a bit of a fact of a stereotype, but it's that deeply ingrained. Before we've seen Eleni, like this all deeply Christian names, Christian peoples that were so from some of the earliest ages of Christianity, as you know. So David II, that was Lebna Dengels, succeeded Naohot after his death and faced renewed raids from Mahfuds, who was still active. So in 1516, Lebna Dengel successfully ambushed Mahfuds during an invasion, causing his death. Mahfud's death. Lebna Dengel then sacked the city of Dakar in Adal, and around the same time, the Portuguese fleet attacked Zeila as well on the Somali coast, and Lebna Dengel's victory exposed the internal weaknesses of the Adal Sultanate, leading to power struggles and the assassinations of multiple sultans there. So to make the long story short and simpler than, of course it is, the Somalis were Muslims, the Ethiopians, Christians. And eventually Garad Abun Adash took control of the Sultanate, restoring order. However, Sultan Abu Bakr ibn Muhammad, who moved the capital to Arar, killed Abun Adash with the help of Somali nomads on the hinterland. And a rebel named Ahmad ibn Ibrahim emerged, killing Abu Bakr, replacing him with the latter's brother, Umar-Din, as a puppet. Right? It was a principle of dynastic legitimacy that, of course, these warlords were exploiting, were in control of the military. Ahmad then focused on conquering Abyssinia through multiple campaigns. In 1529, Ahmad won a striking victory over the Ethiopians at the Battle of Shimbrakure, marking the beginning of the conquest, and he would face challenges, of course, controlling his nomadic troops and opposition from his Arari soldiers. Ahmad returned to Arar to rebuild his forces and later occupied Abyssinian territories. However, a small Portuguese contingent arrived in Massawa in 1541. This is the one we will see now in action, leading to the defeat of Ahmad and his eventual death. Right, and this is like a pivotal moment also in Abyssinian history. And the Adal Sultanate lost most of its territory after Ahmad's death, in fact, and Nur ibn Yahid became the de facto ruler of Adal. Nur attempted a failed jihad and was defeated by the Abyssinians, who advanced into Adal. Nur strengthened the defenses of Arar and launched another invasion in 1559, killing the Ethiopian Emperor Gelawdewos, which means Claudius. All right. And this tells you, of course, how much, in that sense, Western connection existed between Ethiopia and Roman and Christian past. Now, in spite of this Abyssinian setback, the region was devastated by the Barentu Oromos. The Oromos are, as you know, an Ethiopian Kenyoid ethnicity. We will describe them later, because between the 16th and 17th century they migrated essentially to from North Kenya to northern regions of Ethiopia, and they actually started clashing with the Abyssinians, but sort of being eventually ruled over by the empire. And as we've seen, they had given trouble to the Somalis as well. In fact, Nur's army was defeated by the Oromos, known also as the Galla, as we'll see. So Nur died in 1567, and Uthman the Abyssinian succeeded him, signing a humiliating peace treaty with the Oromos. And this led to a rebellion Uthman was overthrown by Tala Abbas. Tala was later overthrown by fanatics who wanted to continue the holy war against the Christians. And Muhammad ibn Nasir replaced him. Muhammad's campaign ended in disaster, and he was killed at the Battle of the Webe River. Mansur ibn Muhammad fought against the Oromos but couldn't defeat them either, and also reconquered, however, Ausa and Zayla. Eventually, the imamate of Ausa emerged as the power locally as Adal declined. The imamate was later destroyed by the Afar Normans, paving the way to the emergence of the Ausa Sultanate. The decadence of Adal is to be attributed, as we've seen, to this chronic instability, tribal differences, and internal struggles that prevented it from withstanding the Oromo migrations like the Ethiopian empire instead did. And this is, in fact, the point. After all, the Ethiopians were sort of the more advanced and also the big power around. The war of that we're describing before, with Adal between 1529 and 1541, led, as we've seen, to Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi attempted to conquer Abyssinia. And the Ethiopian emperor at that point sought further military assistance to the Portuguese. And João Bermudez was sent to Lisbon to request aid on behalf of the Ethiopians, and that's when, as we were saying before, for the Sultanate of Adal, that the Portuguese fleet commanded by Estevão da Gama arrived in Massawa, where in 1541, and the Portuguese engaged in battles against the Adal Sultanate. That was at this point, by the way, sponsored by the Ottomans. So even if Abyssinia was not under, say, direct threat of Ottoman occupation, still the Islamic vassals of the Sublime Porte were trying essentially to control the Ethiopian agricultural basin, and de facto turning this place into a Muslim country, paying tribute to the Turks, etc. So this was a great issue, because, as you know, the Portuguese were fighting with the Islamic naval forces, the Ottoman proxies, in the Indian Ocean. It was a fierce war. We'll talk about this. It's a very important chapter, as you know, in early modern maritime warfare, especially. And we can appreciate the actual Portuguese contingent of 1541-43. Consisted essentially of 400 Portuguese, mostly all aggressive arquebusiers, but with some Houtbikes as well. There was a 5 band and 130 slaves who also fought. These were African slaves that the Portuguese had deported from other parts of Africa, mostly the Atlantic one. Together with the drum and fife band, by the way, there were several banners, including the one of the Portuguese king, easily enough for one per arquebusier element, and the royal banner of Portugal being of crimson and white damask with a cross, and other flags of blue and white with red crosses, plus this force was accompanied by 1,000 stand of matchlocks and some cannon, after being jealously armed and manned just by Portuguese personnel, whereas the rest of the Portuguese force actually acquired also enough horses from the local Ethiopians to provide their commander with, in fact, this mixed element of Portuguese lancers and Abyssinian cavalry that we will describe. The Portuguese initially succeeded, as we've seen, against the Somalis, but they were eventually defeated at the Battle of Wolfla in 1542. Yet they regrouped with Ethiopian forces and achieved victories over the Adal Sultanate. Al-Ghazi, the leader of the latter power, was killed in the Battle of Vaina Daga in 1543, leading to the routing of his forces. It's interesting to notice that the Portuguese contingent remained largely in Ethiopia. The survivors, in fact, remaining, taking local wives, who by the mid-18th century had given rise to a hereditary regiment of 3,000 unruly, half-breed matchlock men firing muskets from rests still. So this is hyper fascinating because essentially, of course, like musketry technology had heavily evolved in the last couple of centuries, but this regiment of Portuguese ancestry had specialized practically in this firepower capacity to remain relevant, considering the standards of local warfare that definitely did not evolve along the pattern of pike and shot warfare linear tactics at this point, remaining largely based on the tribal contingents. We will see now how they were armed, essentially in a medieval fashion still. This victory and the Holy Ghost were connected with the Portuguese. By the way, would have not even renounced their Catholicism, aside from the fact, yes, over the generations things would change. And the war against the Adal is really significant as a turning point in Abyssinian warfare, because first of all, the Ethiopians were this one of the independent African nations to come into conflict with the Ottomans, and so their resistance, also as Christians in general, was, as we've seen, very important for the Habsburgs, for the Catholic powers in Europe and now in the world through the colonies, or at least, it was a clash mostly with Muslim forces, right, backed by the Turks, and initially, like, the Abyssinians had difficulties to make headway against the Ottoman-provided firearms of their enemies, and with the arrival of the Portuguese, instead, allows, especially the Emperor Claudius, ruling between 1540 and 1551, actually to score considerable success in spite of his ultimate death in battle. All right. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, as we were remembering before, the Galla, Oromo people, migrated from North Kenya to northern regions of Ethiopia, leading to wars with the Abyssinian Empire. Emperor Susenyos I married an Oromo woman and relied on Oromo support to gain power. This naturally opened the way to lots of Galla auxiliaries employed by the Abyssinians as well. There were tensions still when the emperor attempted to convert the Oromo to Christianity. In fact, many Gallas converted to Islam, as we were saying before, to preserve their identity, and formed alliances with other subdued groups in Ethiopia. The Oromo/Galla are very interesting from a military point of view, especially when you understand their background. It was less developed than the Abyssinian one, still providing with good troops. The Oromo are a pastoralist people, right, from today's southern Ethiopia, that were first recorded in the 60s of the 15th century by the Italian cartographer Fra Mauro. They inhabited the area for at least a century and a half before the aforementioned migration to the north. The Oromo life was governed by the Gada system, which allowed them to choose 9 leaders every 8 years, so they were essentially a tribal confederacy. And the first detailed history of the Oromo people is from the Ethiopian monk Bare's, in fact titled History of the Galla, where in 1593. The migration to North Abyssinia is linked to Imam Ahmad ibn Ibrahim's attempt at conquest of the Ethiopian Empire that we were talking about before. That's why it was necessary to digress on the Somalis. And this war, as we've seen, created a political and military vacuum that eventually allowed the Oromo to take on the same Adal and to move relatively unhindered into, in fact, both Abyssinia and the Somali Sultanate. The Oromos acquired horses, and their Gada system helped coordinate Oromo cavalry warriors, enabling them to fight effectively. This is, again, particularly relevant because it turns out that even though these people were not, together with, generally speaking, the Ethiopians, not particularly disciplined, right? This were not, as we've seen, states. There was no capacity to impose coercively this hard discipline at a collective level. There weren't enough resources, right? But aside from the consequently easier, tactic of fierce charge, that wasn't all like for these cultures, but in fact we find the Galla tribesmen described as coming on not without order like barbarians, but in formed squadrons, right? Which tells you, of course, how this order would have been found also in the Abyssinian forces, except the Oromos were likely more combative because of their more warlike temper. The Ethiopian Empire had established some sort of pacification, some greater regulation. Of course, they had the better army in the first place, but this more warlike tribal element could be found from these peripheral peoples that still lived in, say, pretty wild context at the outskirts of it. The Ethiopian hinterland is very hard. We're talking about it also in the video I made a couple of weeks ago about the Italian Empire and the war in Ethiopia, right? The Italians took over very easily, like the entire country in 1935, 36. But until throughout the entire following war II, like there was Ethiopian guerrilla all over, like the hinterland part, obviously. Now, because also it's an immense territory, by the way. So in the early 17th century, the Oromo gradually integrated into the Ethiopian Empire as well. Like Emperor Susenyos I, who came to power, as we've seen, with Oromo support, employed the Oromo warriors, also their tactics, exploiting them, how they already performed them, and even combat formations against rivals for the throne. He also established dynasties such as the Yehu one in the Islamic Vara Imana, which transformed Bolo, for example, into an Islamic state. In the late 17th century, 5 Oromo states emerged in the Giber region, arose through the transformation of pastoralism to agriculture due to the fertile and adequately watered land of the region. So, of course, the Oromos had carried out an act of force, exploiting like the political instability, the frontier areas, and they, of course, were, like most nomads, seeking for like better places where to live and finally settled down for more, less stressful existence. And so, again, more fertile, adequately watered territory. These changes allowed the Gada officials to acquire more authority, by the way, because they had more resources. So they converted their elective offices into permanent monarchical institutions, which of course changed the same ways of war of the Oromos, in spite of the fact that, generally speaking, the entire system was gradually sort of going towards at least what was essentially European influence, even though still remaining founded on the local tradition that didn't have many chances, just simply evolve from itself. The last period under examination is the Gondarian one that would last from 1632 until 1769. It's called like this because that's when the center of Gondar became the capital of the Christian dominion under the Emperor Fasilides, who ruled, in fact, between 1632 and 1667. Under him, Jesuits, who had originally come, as we've seen with the Portuguese expedition, gained favor at court, but were eventually expelled. And the native religion was restored. This may sound complicated, but as we've seen, the Oromo's takeover, like of the ruling dynasty, had temporarily sort of obfuscated the Eastern Christian native religion of Abyssinia. So Fasilides restores it, right, coming to power. Also, however, having alliances with neighboring Islamic powers. This is actually the golden age of Ethiopian philosophy. We don't have to talk too much about the details, but it's important also from a military point of view, because even if it's beyond our scope, we understand that there was a lot of Western influence. Gondarian art, for example, drew inspiration from Byzantine, Western Baroque, and Renaissance models. As we were saying at the beginning, if you look at these paintings that I mostly provided you with for the images, like they're very much inspired to all these mostly like Byzantine and even Renaissance Italian painting, right? So this is clearly seen, like they were Eastern Orthodox, but they would have a very iconic way of representing art, Byzantine fashion. The Italian Renaissance was by far the most influential source of culture at the time. The Christian connection, like being surrounded by Muslim powers at the time, like also with this point mostly, still at least just up to the beginning, that the end of today's video's timeline had been mostly Catholic presence. So that's the picture. There was a rebellion by the Aga population in Lasta. It was suppressed by Fasilides. The Agav or Agev are a Cushitic ethnic group native to the northern highlands of Ethiopia, neighboring Eritrea. Also, Fasilides attempted to establish trade relations with Yemen to bypass Oman, that was pro-Ottoman, definitely. But he was, for this reason, unsuccessful. By the way, there were lots of things going on, including the Dutch and the Portuguese fighting against one another. We'll have to look at this, of course, in another video. Right. So when we look at the Abyssinian forces as a whole, we appreciate a traditional military culture. For example, Galaveda's army consisted of 500 horse and 8,000 infantry, clad in the local dress of loose tunics and breeches that were basically like the only color most of the troops had. Armor was rare, as we'll see now, especially among infantry. The majority, by the way, of the Abyssinian foot was armed with bows, which tells you, of course, like about the sort of tribal hunting sort of background of these individuals. You have, however, heavier troops, of course, wielding, for example, straight swords that are within, in fact, a pre-Turkish, pre-Mongol, especially, tradition, which is important because you know that the Mamluks, the Ottomans, essentially fell instead in that tradition. Instead, Ethiopia had maintained, together with Arabia, southern Arabian part, the original, straight sort of sword from at least for the men at arms, for the knights, that is even of Iranian origin, of Indo-European origin, back in the day. They would wield hide shields, right? The swordsman had, of course, this long straight sword, like the most affluent, the nobility, right? It required really a lot of training and physique. In fact, some of them were double-handed swords, and you could use them actually also one and a half, because you could pass to them after discarding the shield, right? However, there is also a typical, there are not necessarily secondary weapon, something of course lighter than these bulkier blades. That is in fact sometimes enormous, at least in the circle, sickle-shaped shottle, right, intended to hook over opponents' shields, but also just like to chop limbs like crazy, which is in this pretty likely or mostly an armored context, like a blood feast, really. And Abyssinian swordsmen were prized abroad as guardsmen until access was cut off by the Portuguese domination of the sea. We will see this during the Middle Ages because, again, Ethiopia had an important military tradition historically since Roman times and before, of course. Simple, again, a normal army would have displayed a traditional tactical complexity with cavalry, swordsmen, spearmen, archers, skirmishers, the latter especially in the forms of javelin men, right? The Abyssinian infantry had the stabbing spear, of different types now, of course, like it was mostly the standard type trooper. And they added a large round hide shield, which was designed to absorb, in fact, much missile that did characterize like the era historically, as we've seen all these hunters and produce good archers, right? This was the case in places also like Sudan, as those troops were also used by the Ayyubids, the Fatimids. Combined arms here were important, like having this bulk of spearmen and skirmishing with archers. Like Arabia had actually very similar type of warfare, right? And there was also this back and forth, like also across the Red Sea in terms of piracy. There was a lot of dynamism. And of course, in the major engagements of the period, what you see is the, say, battle lines mostly segmented in width, not much in depth, and they had fairly simple tactics with different, like the centered wings, like this bulk of infantry fundamentally. But cavalry is also relevant, and there are maneuvers, like often the Islamic forces are more dynamic depending on the, let's say, on the backing, on the support. But the Abyssinians had developed capacity of matching them. Consider that Abyssinia was a bit isolated. Doesn't matter how big it was, like it was surrounded by enemies, as we've seen the same Portuguese allies, however, keep the country a bit under their control because they are interested in the ports, right, and therefore controlling the interland resources. So even though there is, for example, like an important amount of horse, this is not necessarily receiving the same logistical support, technical capacities, etc. Abyssinian cavalry were mostly provided by the Sheva and the Galad or Oromo to the south. Sheva is a historical region of Ethiopia which was formerly an autonomous kingdom within the same Ethiopian Empire. And actually the modern Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa is located at its very center. So there is a lot of interesting continuity here in terms of elites, of surplus, statehood to some degree. Sheva as a region in Abyssinia was initially part of an Islamic state called the Makhzumi dynasty that had been founded back at the end of the 9th century. And French archaeologists discovered 3 urban centers, including the Nora site in eastern Sheva, and it's been claimed that the region was used by Solomonic forebears, descendants of pre-Zagwe Aksumite emperors, as a safe haven when threatened by enemies. So these centers had sort of emerged as strategic avant-posts to allow practically like the Ethiopians to launch raids, and then in case of failure, like falling back on these fortifications. Sheba eventually became part of Abyssinia after the rise of the Amara Solomonic dynasty. The province served as the birthplace of future Abyssinian emperors such as Tsar Jacob and David II. And in 1528, Sheba was overrun by Islamic invaders from the Sultanate of Adal, destroying its ancient cities. And in the late 16th century, the Oromos overran most of the region, with the eastern fringe inhabited by the Arla people. See how fairly complex the picture really is. Ethiopian cavalry was typically armed with a short spear and 2 or more javelins, and often no shield. The reason being, at the higher level, the fact that some noblemen provided with mail, and so like pretty heavy armor for Abyssinian standards, sort of discarded the shield or used a smaller one, right, compared to the sort of ethnic typical one. At the lower level, of course, like having like less weight in the first place, it makes you lighter and faster in combat, which would make these troops like very good skirmishers. And so this is basically the equivalent of what you've seen on foot with javeliners, archers. There are horse archers as well. There are lots of interesting combinations. In general, in horse archery is not that developed at all. Like the entire, like if you look at the Horn of Africa, everything is very like down to pretty like Southwest Arabia, like very infantry-based warfare, like historically. So that there is probably this sense of warrior, again, direct kind of clash. Of course, cavalry has come throughout the Middle Ages to increase in relevance, etc. But it's also less. There is less of an equestrian culture than some, especially the northern areas. In fact, the Abyssinians mostly rode scrubby ponies with simple saddles, with a loop for the big toe instead of a stirrup, which does not inspire particular shock capacity. Of course, like you would have not liked to have been charged by an Ethiopian horseman, because you'd have ended up like with a broken spine anyway. But just at a collective level, this tells us, of course, that this cavalry was much less drilled, and probably also, like in comparison to infantry, was weaker than some. Here we're talking Renaissance warfare, so in Europe we already like sort of bypassed that kind of cavalry dominance. But at least for these peoples locally, it was still like the feudal system, and that's how far they could go in terms of this cavalry development. It gives you an idea of how sort of flat, like the primitive and sort of underdeveloped the entire picture is to some standards. All right. There were some ways, of course, of distinguishing the elite. For example, the shield was, as we've seen, actually very important in a symbolical sense. For example, it could be embellished with silver or lion's mane in the case probably of the ultra elite. But overall, this was also like a ritual matter, like sometimes also a parade measure. We have, interestingly enough, a black horse, right? It is properly sub-Saharan slave troops of the Abyssinian emperor household that are really elite, right? They're slaves in as much as they are Islamic tribesmen from much less developed areas of sub-Saharan Africa. Apparently, these guys had large horses and arms imported from Sinnar, which is West India, Maharashtra, which is also a very underrated aspect of Indian warfare itself. There was a great contact with the Horn of Africa and lots of Ethiopians fighting in the Mughal armies. So the Abyssinian emperors cared very much about their relations with India. As we've seen, they tried to establish outposts commercially, also in Yemen, etc., for that specific purpose. And they provided these black guards, slave guards, with this imposing mounts that probably were the heaviest cavalry that, again, as an elite unit, the emperor could field. All right. They also wore black plumed copper helmets with a short mail visor and hip-length mail shirts, and pushed their legs through horizontal slots in their horses, kilted barding. I made a video recently about the sub-Saharan troops in the essentially Islamic, Iberian, and North African powers, and I talked there a bit about the heaviest type of cavalrymen you could find in the savannah stripe. That is essentially from like the area from which these troops really came from, and the Ethiopians had access to them, as we've seen. And of course, there would be a nobiliar Abyssinian cavalry. It was the equivalent of that, and probably something also more advanced, more also overall open actually to external influences than at least probably like the savannas. This black guard had high saddles with Arab stirrups, in fact, and they were armed with a 4.2 meters long lance, also an axe. So you see a very advanced type of warfare. A very high level of individual and collective training. Like a lance of 4 meters is a lot, right? These are properly lancers that were credited, in fact, of being capable to charge through all the cavalry of Abyssinia. That tells you, in fact, how, say, exceptional they were. And in fact, say, scholars think that this feat was not a particularly arduous task, because Ethiopian cavalry would sort of melt away. Yes and no. I mean, it depends really which kind of enemies we're talking about, because it's not just a guard that makes it all. But there was an effort, definitely, by the emperors to at least provide themselves with a unit that, as expensive as it was however, what could not properly be matched, at least in open field. And so in a pitched battle, which is not the normal guerrilla that you're gonna get through the Ethiopian highlands, that, however, is also what you don't really need to control. What you need to control is the river valleys, is the the more fertile and watered land. But as we've seen also with the Oromos, the peoples from the other side are pretty angry and kind of violent, and always ready to raid and to create problems, like also to the more organized imperial military. We know that the forces from the Tigray area were apparently also well equipped. There was a tribal state in the Wadi area as well that could provide with 10,000 infantry with javelins at least, and that had also 5,000 horses, mainly again bareback light cavalry. So we're talking just about the aforementioned type of raiders. However, there were also 500, so 1/10 of them in mail, which would make like more or less an average proportion, and for this area is also a heavy one to sustain. Also with antelope hide horse caparisons, which tells you about the again the sort of elite standard. In fact, all these 500 were lancers, right? But the rest is really just like skirmishers. And again, that's what, after all, if you fight in Ethiopia, unless you master pike and shot tactics with artillery support, like the small yet over, say, mainly successful Portuguese contingent was pretty small anyway, would do. Like, that's pretty much what you not just have against whom you have to regularly fight in this region, but also the best thing that you can use as well, because heavier troops are basically just going to be bogged down in the hinterland, where you have to use this sort of guerrilla tactics and counter-insurgency through these lighter forces as well. So everything was pretty sort of evened by the circumstances, right? By the way, the Ethiopians made important use of palisades, dry stone walls, or thorn boma. The boma is a livestock enclosure, a stockade, a corral, small fort, right? And interestingly enough, at least until, like, we know till the 16th century, there were Abyssinian generals mounted on elephants, right? There's something that was gone because of, the proximity to elephant sources, probably also some Indian influence in that regard, and that is quite interesting, but also kind of anachronistic and just for the elite. We do not have essentially elephant units in the Ethiopian army. We have camel scouts in some of the more fringe areas, and the 16th century sees the again introduction of gunsmiths, renegade Arabs, later the Portuguese, the latter which would have fought again with their officers, cadres, half-pikes, arquebusiers, African slaves from other parts of the continent. From mid-16th century, let's say, the Abyssinians would have started introducing matchlock men, their infantry, all right, autonomously, I mean. So the average final rank spearman was accompanied now by these pockets of gunners that were at least more structured, at least probably with this matchlock technology, like tendentially, say, thought at least towards uniformation in the Western model, but again, very contained numbers, because again, if you look even at the later colonial times, still by the Battle of Adwa at the end of the 19th century, I think only 1/3 of the Abyssinians had some of these older gun types, aside from at that point like French and Russian rifles that were sent to fight the Italians. But aside from that, they were quite backwards. They had, again, most of their troops would still be Malay ones. They had numbers on their side. The Empire of Ethiopia could mobilize a large amount of forces that could be enough also be thrown at the enemy, especially on tough ground, whenever they were more skilled, more aware of the places. All right, but overall, like, at least the Battle of Adwa was a pretty severe Italian mistake, even more than a defeat, like, because they had it, right? They could have crushed them easily. The command was rather incapable, and but the same Ethiopians were about to collapse because of the sheer numbers that they had sent. Had they waited for longer, probably would have had enormous difficulties keeping these troops together. So you can imagine, just for early modern and late medieval times, like what this kind of warfare really was. But overall, again, the Horn of Africa was sort of more advanced, basically, most parts of Africa. Surely the most advanced of all the sort of sub-Saharan, if you can so say. Even if the Horn of Africa is a region on its own. The Somalis, as we've seen, were there. The Eritreans, I mean, they were all pretty much of the same level, but again, sometimes the Islamic powers could be supplied by the Ottomans in sort of more interesting ways. The Ethiopians were mostly relying on their own resources. And from the beginning of the 17th century, we have this Black Horse Guard, and the matchlock man would have sort of been upgraded with muskets and rests. We've seen how these resisted until the 18th century, with from the descendants of the Portuguese regiment had come to fight in 1541, 43. All right. So this is just an overview. This warfare, I try to use the best images available. There are not many. Right? On some topics, you really find a lot of stuff. On this, actually, I found more than I could think, but it's also a bit repetitive with all this idealized images, mostly of the heroes represented in the question fashion. But it would be actually a lot to uncover about Abyssinian warfare. Today we stop it here, but again, there is nothing in theory that we won't cover on Schwerpunkt. For today, in fact, again, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.